And now you're aware that we can start. So my name is Anjali Dutt. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Cincinnati. Myself and Danielle Kohfeldt helped me organize this panel, and we're really excited about it. So I'll just say a couple things really briefly to get us started. The title of the panel is The Psychology of Neoliberalism. We're looking at existence, implications, and resistance. And we have 3 talks that we're really excited to share with you all. The first talk is called The Social Psychology of Neoliberalism. And the focus is on, the focus is on a special issue that is being put out by the Journal of Social Issues, so a SPSSI publication. And the authors of this paper are Karim, Bettache, Chiu, and Beattie. And Peter will be discussing some of what you can expect in this special issue that we're all really excited about. The second talk is titled Neoliberal Relationality, Love as Mutual Growth or Obligation of Care. And we'll Darlingtina, Atakere, Sara, Estrada-Villalta, and Glenn Adams wrote this paper, and Darlington will be sharing it with us. And then the last talk is a paper by myself and Danielle Kohfeldt, and we'll be talking about resisting neoliberalism through liberatory care. So with that, I'll turn the discussion to Peter. We'll take maybe 1 or 2 questions after each talk, and then we'll save the bulk for whatever time is left at the end. Thanks. So thank you, Peter.
All right, yeah, my pleasure. I'm happy to speak also for Chiu and Karim Bettache. We're all going to be working on this special issue. I thought I would just use this brief time to summarize the issue, give you some idea of some of the papers that will be included, and also to advertise it for those interested in responding to the open call, which I believe is open until November of this year. So the basic gist of the issue is based around the proposition that neoliberal ideology shapes and alters society's norms and attitudes, and through that, the thoughts, feelings, and even actions of its citizens. The most important part of neoliberalism here would be its roots in rational choice theory and its conception of individuals as, enterprising free agents who are held accountable for the choices they make, and ideally creating a sort of meritocracy where everyone is rewarded according to their contribution to society. So the specific areas where we're looking for contributions are in 4 main themes. So one, which I think has the most need at this point, is neoliberalism in psychology itself. And so we asked contributors to consider the status of neoliberalism with regard to theory within the field of psychology. And I think this would also allow people to write about how the way that neoliberalism has reshaped universities themselves and how the structure of universities may be affecting the actual content of the field of psychology. Second would be cultural dominance and homogenization of global cultures. So contributors will be discussing the potential role of neoliberalism as a force behind the relative privilege of certain cultures over others and how this may affect individual psychology. Third is neoliberalism, values, and morality. So contributors are going to be tackling the question of the effects that neoliberalism may have on our moral values, specifically perhaps its potential to erode our sort of classical political morality, that is civic responsibilities, ethics of interdependence, etc. And then lastly, the 4th theme is neoliberalism, social inequality, and social justice. So contributors are going to be reflecting on the relationship between neoliberalism and social inequality. It could be many different forms, including racism, poverty, etc., and social justice. So with that kind of brief overview, I thought I would start off with one of the projects that I'm going to be working on my own, since it includes a little bit of history of the concept. And specifically because the word liberal is just one of the most annoying words, because it has so many different meanings, many of which contradict each other. So starting with the kind of classical liberalism and classical liberals, it's often argued that the classical liberals believed that all people were sort of perfectly rational, and that because of this rationality, democracy and free markets would be an ideal system. But if you read some of the classical liberals, you'll see very brilliant observations about human psychology scattered within their writings. So John Stuart Mill kind of prefigured modern psychological research on confirmation bias and motivated reasoning when he wrote that there's an almost irresistible tendency of the human mind to become a slave of its own hypotheses. And when it has once habituated itself to reason, feel, and conceive under certain arbitrary conditions, at length to mistake these conditions for laws of nature. And John Locke, in a way, kind of prefigured system justification. He wrote, "People are not so easily got out of their old forms as some are apt to suggest. They are hardly to be prevailed with to amend the acknowledged faults in the frame they have been accustomed to. And if there be any original defects or advantageous ones introduced by time or corruption, it is not an easy thing to get them changed, even when the whole world sees there's an opportunity for it." So I just bring this up because later writers, I think, conflated the way that liberalism had evolved with the way that it originally was, and I think it kind of shortchanges some of the classical liberal writers who had a more, I think, accurate and broad conception of human psychology that included a lot of areas of irrationality. But as liberal economics developed, and I think particularly when the neoclassical school first arose and then rose to dominance in the late 1800s, it relied on, it absolutely had to have a much stronger claim about human rationality to be coherent, because its dominant methodology was to create mathematical models which require gross simplifications in order to work, and many of those simplifications had to do with human psychology and our capacities. So at any rate, then you have the kind of classical liberal economic view that essentially died after World War II, when societies had been through the experience of the Great Depression. You had all sorts of liberal economists saying that we just need to double down on our theory of small state, big market, get the state ever more out of the market, and everything will be fine in the end. And when that was just obvious, a very obvious failure, liberalism was pretty much a dead ideology. So that Richard Nixon famously would say decades later that we're all Keynesians now. We all accept that there has to be significant government intervention into the economy. When I guess there are many competing explanations for the sort of failure of either Keynesianism or, as Joan Robinson called it, bastard Keynesianism. But leaving that aside for now, neoliberalism was first devised around the time of the Great Depression and World War II as a way to kind of avoid the very effective critiques of economic liberalism that had been occasioned by its massive failures in the real world. And so the main difference between liberalism and neoliberalism would be, instead of small state, big market, it would be more like big state, big market. But it's not supposed to be the big state of Keynesianism or social democracy. It's supposed to be a state that would be large enough to create markets everywhere. And this relied fundamentally on Hayek's argument that markets are the greatest information processors known to man, and because of that, socialism was bound to failure, because you couldn't have any bureaucrats processing information in a way as successful as the market does that. But it also included folk psychology, ideas about what human psychology must be like in order for markets to be such incredible information processors. So this article is going to focus on the kind of folk psychology of neoliberalism. then look to the evidence that has been accumulated by psychological research on whether this folk psychology has any demonstrable connection to reality, and then to look sort of a more speculative enterprise to look at possible psychological effects of neoliberalism as it has been sort of rolled out and implemented starting in the 1970s, and today is the predominant ideology and kind of policy compass the world over. And then, of course, the other definitions of liberalism. You've got liberalism in the U.S. as a political ideology that's basically used to describe the left in the United States. But then, of course, that conflicts incredibly with economic liberalism, which is quite opposite. And then you have international relations theory liberalism and international relations theory neoliberalism. So I thought it'd be helpful to just get over some of these definitional issues at the beginning. So one very interesting paper is being worked on by Katarzyna Jasko, Marta Sastok, Joanna Gritzmala-Mocenitska, Marta Maj, and Eric Glansky. They're looking at what sorts of values and motivations can successfully get people to sacrifice their time and maybe even money, maybe even freedom, to join movements for social change. And they find that in contradiction with some previous research that focuses on how negative emotions can motivate social change, they find that the sense of pride, strength, and meaning that participants derive from their beliefs and then their actions for that belief or those beliefs were very powerful predictors of staying with a movement and continuing to engage with the movement. So that has some pretty obvious, I think, implications for real world political action. That those who want to incite social change should move from a sort of passive stance of just opposition to a more collective engagement that offer positive visions, actual positive proposals that people can get behind. Another very different paper by Chiu that he's working on is on cultural dominance and the erosion of national feelings. So he's using the case of Hong Kong. The first study looks at the Hong Kong film industry, which resonates with me personally because I don't know if anyone here was a big fan of Hong Kong movies in the 80s and 90s. They produced, bar none, by far the best action movies in the world. They made Hollywood look positively boring. But that's since changed, and so he uses the Hong Kong movie industry to track changes in cultural hegemony in Hong Kong. But more interestingly, he's trying to see whether people's perception of cultural hegemony is linked with moral values or evaluation of moral values. And he looks at the case of China. And initial findings are that those who believe that globalization had erosive effects on local culture were positively identified with China, and then the opposite held as well. The underlying theory here is that neoliberalism being a theory that everything works out for the best if we have fully competitive markets, it puts a premium on competition. And if there are some countries that are more powerful, it would stand to reason that they're more powerful because they're just better competitors, so they deserve it. And so he's testing to see if there seems to be evidence for that on the level of your average person here. Then we've got a paper from Yang Yuan Chen and Qingwan Wei, belief in cultural dominance. So they're proposing a concept called belief in cultural dominance. That's meant to capture people's internalization of neoliberalism. And so the idea is that if you have internalized neoliberalism to the extent that you privilege more dominant cultures because, again, they're the winners in the free market competition, so they must be deserving and more meritorious, then when people are considering instances of kind of cross-cultural fusion or an enterprise in which two cultures participated, that they would predominantly recognize only the contribution of the dominant culture. So that's what they are working on. Then I'm going to do this really quickly because the authors are here on the panel, so I'm nervous about presenting their research incorrectly. But Anjali and Danielle are working on neoliberal ideology and reactions to refugees, which I find really interesting because, according to the kind of ideal type of neoliberalism, it should be allied with free trade theory, which classically argued for the free movement of both capital and people. But if there's some psychological motivation behind the acceptance of that ideology, that again focuses on competition, and that focus ends up subsuming or getting rid of concepts of solidarity and the shared obligation to others, equality, etc., that you might actually find people who have internalized neoliberalism more being more opposed to immigration and to treat immigrants as less than the in-group. And then the last abstract I'm just going to summarize briefly is from John Jost, Flavio Azevedo, and Joanna Sterling. And it's very similar to the previous one in that, again, the ideology in itself, in its pure form, would seem to just privilege freedom over everything else, and it shouldn't really be correlated with authoritarianism or social dominance orientation, etc. But that's what they're going to be looking at, whether that in fact holds. One of the things they're also doing is that, as some of you may be aware, there's been some recent research challenging the psychological conception of ideology as primarily between a desire for hierarchy versus a desire for equality on one end, and then on the other end, a desire for change versus a desire to keep the status quo. Some people have found, using World Values Survey data, that around the world, in most countries outside of the what used to be called the first world, the kind of developed, rich, capitalist countries, it's more common for left-wing economic preferences to correlate with right-wing social preferences. So they have suggested that the dimension that makes more sense is freedom versus protection. But leaving that aside, the authors here are going to be looking at whether that is in fact a better way of looking at the kind of psychological divide between ideologies. And they're going to be investigating whether the relationship between economic attitudes does in fact link up with authoritarianism, social dominance orientation, and system justification. So like the previous paper, where one would assume that neoliberalism would be in favor of, people who have identify with neoliberal ideology should be in favor of more immigration, free trade of people and capital. Likewise here, you would expect that neoliberalism in its pure form would have nothing to do with authoritarianism. In fact, it should be negatively related to it, since the focus is on free individuals freely competing in a meritocratic competitive marketplace. So their work here is going to be examining that. I think that's my 15 minutes, so I will end here and stick around if anyone has any questions.
Thanks so much, Peter. Do we want to take one question before we move on to the next author?
I'm just curious if, and maybe this is just stuff that is being researched for the special issue, but I sometimes wonder if any psychological relationships we see between neoliberal ideology and things like social dominance, like, do we have a sense of whether that's something kind of in sort of dispositional, just a package of psychological traits that tend to go together, or do we think that it's kind of a product of a cultural moment where those things tend to cluster together because elites are kind of pushing this dominant ideology where these things are associated, even if they're not matching quite so well the kind of ideological, the political philosophy that neoliberalism is built on?
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because for me that question is the most interesting one being explored in political psychology now, just my personal opinion, because there's good evidence or good reason to believe that the way that politics is packaged in the mass media that reaches the most people is powerfully going to shape whatever people end up creating as their own ideology, regardless of the kind of elective affinities between psychological traits and ideological components. I'm hopeful that the last paper I just described by Joe Azevedo and Sterling will help elucidate that. I'm personally on the fence. I'm really just looking forward to seeing what research comes up with. I think there are good arguments to be made that it's primarily the psychological traits that's driving the adoption and even the creation of the ideology or the ideological options in the first place. But then I think there's also very good reasons and evidence that it's very powerfully influenced by the most available packaging of ideological components in the mass media. So yeah, I don't think that's been answered definitively. I think that it's going to be an active research question for the next few years, maybe more.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. We're going to move on to the next presenter, but it'd be wonderful if at the end we had some time left for questions for everybody on the panel. So thanks again. I'm so excited about the special issue.
Sure, thanks.
Thank you. All right, now to figure out. I think we'll just take that one. Okay, go ahead. But I have to close mine. Okay. Got it. Yeah. No, you can leave it. I don't think it's gonna get in the way. Just to open mine. Oh, you have to take over. Yeah. USB. That is it. Oh. I need help. All right. Is it possible to minimize this? I can move that. So yeah, so it will block mine. And then Peter needs to go. Okay, does that work? Yes, that works. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Darlingtina Atakere. I'm from the University of Kansas, and today I will be presenting our work on neoliberal relationality, love as mutual growth or obligations of care. Hang on. Sorry, the computer. Oh, I should use that. Okay.
Yeah. Have a bit of trouble with it.
All right. Thank you for that. I have loud voice. I don't want to blast people's eardrums. So I'll turn this away later. Okay. So I do not feel qualified at all in the presence of the panel, experts on the panel today to tell you what neoliberalism is. But when my colleagues and I think of neoliberalism, we think of it as a political and economic system that is based on faith in free market economies. We also think of it as being characterized by distrust in government regulation and collectivization, except to support conditions for frictionless markets. We conceive neoliberalism as something that valorizes competition, whereby entities win and lose as a function of merit and efficiency. And it also extends free market ideology to social sphere and public goods with corresponding privatization of the public space. And neoliberalism to us has faith in choice, where there is that belief that societal institutions functions best
when people are liberated to choose from competing providers. And finally, we see it as it conceives development as an economic growth. So you wonder, how does neoliberalism manifest in psychology? One of the things we're interested in is the fact that it resonates with the idea of what Marcus and colleagues called independent self-ways that is highly evident in weird settings. Weird setting being Western educated, industrialized, rich, and what my advisor says, supposedly democratic settings. And independent self-ways is really the experience of an authentic self that is abstracted from social and ecological context. It embodies habits of the mind that orients a person towards opportunities for personal growth and fulfillment, exploration and expression of authentic desires, and the pursuit of defining aspirations. Its manifestation includes entrepreneurial self, responsibilization, belief in self-care as a route to well-being. And psychology is not merely an observer of neoliberalism. Instead, hegemonic psychology is an active force in the production of neoliberal self and society. So of interest to us is neoliberal relationality. Neoliberal relationality emphasizes voluntarism and choice, where people are free and are responsible to create, maintain, and dissolve connections. It also emphasizes optimality. People make choices based on capacity of their partners to provide optimal satisfaction in context of competition and alternatives. There's also emphasis on expression and validation of feelings. Affluence of the modern order frees some people from struggle for basic needs and leads them to compete for affective rather than use value of things and experiences. It's important to note that it de-emphasizes relational or civic obligation. The argument being that although relational obligations provide assurance of support, they can constitute a drag on the pursuit of personal fulfillment. But again, of interest to us is how neoliberal ideas impact conception of love. But just to give us a brief background of how love is currently conceived in the field of psychology, it's conceived in two ways. One is the growth-oriented or promotion-focused love, which is literally an open approach to connection that is characterized by romantic self-expression and mutual exploration as the foundation of love. And this is the dominant or standard model of love that informs relationship in weird societies. And it is important to note that hegemonic knowledge forms regard this as the naturally superior form of love. And then the second type of love is the maintenance-oriented or prevention-focused love, which is a careful approach to connection characterized by concerns about harmony and attention to obligation. This is the model of love that informs everyday life in many majority world and African settings. And again, hegemonic knowledge form regard it in a more pathological term as an evidence of personal and society immaturity, or what Harrison calls the underdeveloped state of mind. So to give you a research example that looked at the different conception of love, in 2012, Salter and Adams carried out a study on dilemmas of true love, where they had participants in Kansas and participants in Ghana, West Africa, complete a care allocation task as they emerged from Pentecostal charismatic churches or mainstream churches or traditional Western Orthodox churches. And they gave them this vignette that goes, suppose there is a health emergency and several people request your help to pay for medical treatment. The requests are more than you can manage with your limited resources. Whom do you help? Please rank the following relationships according to the order in which you provide treatment. And they listed the different relationships for them to rank. So what they found was that US participants tended to prioritize care to their spouse over their mother. And their responses suggested a construction of love as emotional support. They argued that they were oriented towards neoliberal growth, where participants invest in relationship that provides present satisfaction and best expresses deepest hopes and aspiration. On the other side, Ghanaian participants, especially those in the less cosmopolitan settings, tended to prioritize care to mother over spouse. Their responses suggested a construction of love as what co-called material care, and they were oriented towards broad sustainability, whereby participants invest in relationships that reflects more enduring connection and history of mutual obligation. So for this study, we try to extend their findings, one, by comparing European Americans and African Americans, and two, by measuring the different understanding of love and how that influenced the experience of care or obligation. We recruited 219 participants, 123 of them are European Americans. They were aged approximately 35 on the average, and 53% were female. 43% reported being married, 95% had at least 12 years of education, 90% have at least one parent who's still alive, and 13% currently lives with an elderly parent. The measures they responded to, the first measure they responded to was the conception of love measure, which was adapted from Adams and Platt's 2003 work. The conception of love measure assesses variation in the construction and meaning of love across different cultural ecologies, and it has two dimensions on it. One is the maintenance or oriented conception of love, which measures love as an emotional support and mutual exploration. And an example of item on it is giving up individual desires to help. Sorry, I was talking about the growth one. Example is achieving a fuller life through relationships with loved ones. Then the second one is the maintenance-oriented love, which measures love as about attention to enduring connections and obligation. And example is giving up individual desires to help loved ones. So to get our composite for the neoliberal conception of love, we took the difference between the growth-oriented conception of love and the maintenance-oriented conception of love. The second measure they responded to is the filial piety measure. Filial piety is basically a concept that prioritizes the family unit and values elders with the utmost respect. Put another way, it is the idea of how children should treat their parents, and it has two dimensions to it. The authoritarianism filial piety entails suppressing one's own will and complying with parents' wishes in order to respect their authority. And an example of item on it is take my parents' suggestion even when I do not agree with them. Then the second dimension is the reciprocity filial piety, and this includes providing emotional and material support and care to parents' well-being for their efforts in raising up children or raising you as a child. And example of item on it is to take the initiative to assist my parents when they are busy. Finally, they responded to a vignette about a hypothetical obligation situation. So the vignette goes thus: Alex is a 45-year professional who faces a problem of competing obligations. The retired parents have asked for financial assistance to help them with repairs to Alex's childhood home, where they have lived for the last 50 years. The spouse, also a professional has asked for financial assistance to address a health issue that is not immediately life-threatening, but is a source of discomfort. Given the reality of limited resources, what percentage of available funds would you advise ALES to allocate to each person? And we made sure that at the end of the day, they totaled it up to 100. So to the result, the first thing we're going to look at is the descriptive and the correlation metrics. For the descriptives, what we found is a significant difference in how the European Americans and the African Americans endorse the authoritarianism filial piety, with African Americans endorsing it more than European Americans. We also found a significant difference in how much they allocated to their spouse, with European Americans giving significantly more to their spouse than African Americans did. We also found that neoliberal conception of love was negatively correlated with authoritarianism, filial piety. Just for a reminder of what authoritarianism, filial piety is basically providing for your parents because they are authority figures and have trained us to submit and obey their wishes. So we found that those who construct love in a more neoliberal way did not endorse more of authoritarianism, filial piety, and also people who conceive love more in terms of neoliberal love gave more to their spouse than they did to their mother. Okay, we also found a significant correlation between authoritarianism, filial piety, and allocation of resources, whereby those who endorsed authoritarianism, filial piety gave less to their spouse than those who did not endorse it. So we also ran a couple of hierarchical regression analyses to test the strength of our predators in predicting prioritization of spouse over mother. The first step was just race, and we found that African Americans significantly gave less to their spouse than did European American, just confirming what we already saw in the correlational analysis. And for the second step, we threw in neoliberal conception and the two different dimensions of filial piety. Again, we found that while holding every other thing constant, authoritarianism, filial piety significantly predicted allocation, prioritization of spouse over mother, whereby again people who endorses it gave less to their spouse than people who did not. Reciprocity really we did not see any significant thing that any significant impact of reciprocity on prioritization of spouse over mother. So we ran a mediational analysis to test the indirect effect of race on prioritization of spouse through neoliberal reciprocity and authoritarianism, and the only significant indirect effect of race on prioritization was through authoritarianism. So authoritarianism is the only significant mediator of the effect that race has on prioritization of spouse. The other ones were not significant. And I also have feel free to talk to me more about the results. For sake of time, I'm just presenting some of the key ones I need for the discussion. All right, our findings is informing what we call decolonization of love, because dominant perspective of hegemonic psychological science portray investment in spouse as a sign of healthy development, and also they judge investment in mother and associated ways of being as unhealthy deviation from that normative standard. So our study is located in a broader project of theory from the South, by Komarov and Kamarov that considers knowledge and experience in colonized and racially subordinated settings as an epistemic foundation to rethink the standards of knowledge we have in hegemonic psychological sciences. So rather than take Eurocentric modernity as the epistemological standpoint for understanding reality, we can adopt decolonial strategies. One is to normalize the abnormal. The maintenance-oriented relationality is not suboptimal. It is not to be pathologized, but instead we should see it as a reflection of viable strategies for well-being and assurance of support in cultural ecologies of embeddedness and interdependence. And also, we need to denaturalize the hegemonic standard. The growth-oriented relationality, it is not naturally superior, but again, reflects neoliberal individualist subjectivities that have typically obscured cost. And in this case, for elders whose care and well-being depend on care from others. So they are the product of colonial expropriation and exploitation that enables the experience of abstraction from context. And finally, they reproduce narrow concentration or nuclearization of care at the expense of broader solidarities. Thank you. I'll now take questions. Yes.
I'm kind of curious if you, maybe you could, this is something you'd be interested in looking at in the future, but I wonder if people who show this kind of much more limited kind of focus of love are also lonelier, like attach a measure of loneliness to it. It might kind of highlight your point that it's sort of, we've normalized the view of human nature that in a sort of broader evolutionary context isn't very normal. It's much more isolating to the point that we don't have the same kind of commitments to people outside of our immediate sphere.
Yeah, thank you for that. It will be worth looking into, but I will tell you what I've been looking into as well. Maybe I can add that to it, is the fact that these conceptions can lead to social isolation of the elderly as well. They tend to inform the social, and it's social isolation. It's becoming a huge issue in gerontology because research shows that it kills faster than cancer, faster than obesity, and all these well-known chronic illnesses that we know about. But people don't tend to look at all the social psychological factors that informs social isolation of the elderly. Yeah, thank you for that.
You go. I was just going to say one of the things that strikes me that would be interesting to explore is how do people, people who endorse both of those kinds of love, how do they navigate navigate the situation? So you do have feel very responsible for family members, but you also, so how do people navigate that?
Yeah. We did not look into that yet, but that will be worth looking into to see how people really navigate holding the two different conceptions of love, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a similar question. I was wondering if you're interested in looking at, or if other research has looked at, if people are inconsistent in different spheres with the kind of love that they have. So people might be more inclined to say, well, if I'm not getting anything out of this relationship, I'm going to drop it with, say, extended family, that maybe with close friends, they're actually more willing to invest in a relationship. But then it might be the other way around for parents and spouses. Has there been any work on that?
None that I know of, but it will be worth looking into to see if, basically what you're saying is if a person's context informs how they conceive love and obligation, right? Yeah. All right. I'll take more questions after. Yeah. Thank you so much.
living an autonomous and independent life. It's often those who have been supported or arguably cared for by the neoliberal state, so people with pre-existing, which is inherited wealth. So this brings us into thinking about care. We need to identify practices that are more honestly focused on the interdependence of everyday life and interested in the well-being of the greater whole. Now, in fact, the neoliberal independence that has been used to define Western societies overlooks the experiences and worldviews of women, people of color, and other groups with less socio-political power. And interestingly, these groups historically and persistently have been tasked with more caregiving labor, thus creating vantage points more attuned to the necessity of care and ideal voices to prioritize in theorizing equitable social transformation. So in contrast to neoliberal values that encourage lack of involvement in each other's lives, an ethic of care calls on us to take responsibility for the well-being of each other. In psychology, Carol Gilligan conceptualized the ethics of care as a moral orientation that focuses on maintaining relationships, responding to the needs of others, and a responsibility not to cause harm. During the 1980s and early 1990s, much of the theorizing around ethics of care in psychology centered on the fact that work that was typically gendered as feminism, such as taking care of children or tending to those who are aging or ill, was philosophically and morally rigorous and therefore deserving of greater societal valuing and compensation. And although Gilligan's work has been critiqued for its emphasis on gender differences that don't hold up when empirically tested, in recent years, scholars outside of psychology have taken up a focus on ethics of care orientations and note that it's particularly helpful for promoting more healthful and equitable societies. And it's for this reason that scholars have begun to discuss the need for a politicized ethic of care to ensure that these values are reflected in social institutions and the culture at large. So despite a long history of ethics of care research, one reason we argue that ethics of care have not been more prominent in research on social change is that much of the most transformation-oriented theorizing comes from members of communities who have been particularly underserved by the existing socio-political order, namely women of color. What's particularly interesting here is that this theorizing calls into question myths about individualism that have been valued in many societies. So for example, both Patricia Hill Collins and Bell Hooks have discussed the importance of communality in Black women's lived experience. One example is the practice of other mothering. This is the experience of caring for children or being cared for by women who are not biologically or legally related. And this relates to the person, and this creates a deeply ingrained sense of interdependence and collective responsibility that subverts individualistic narratives about the self-sufficiency of the nuclear family. Then additionally, uniting ethics of care with liberation psychology further enhances our ability to identify an ethic of care that promotes transformation. Liberation psychology is an approach to psychology that aims to understand the experiences of oppressed communities by actively identifying and addressing the socio-political structures that contribute to oppression. Through theories such as de-ideologization and de-alienation, people develop an understanding that the individual experience is shaped by socio-political structure, that there's thus an inherent interconnectivity uniting all lived realities. So while we're talking about care as something that is undervalued in social change, we want to acknowledge that existing care practices are laden with inequality. So for example, women from the global south are regularly forced to take on caregiving labor in the north, which leaves behind unmet care needs in home communities. The same is true for poor and communities of color in the United States. It's with this inequitable distribution and acknowledgement of care labor that we're interested in identifying pathways toward more care-oriented environments and structures. Having caring structures alleviate the individual burden of care while simultaneously works towards promoting greater social justice. So bringing much of this together, we created this chart to explore how care can be used within a neoliberal context to maintain the status quo or exacerbate systems of inequality, or it can be used for more liberatory aims directed towards social transformation, both in more intimate contexts and collectively. At an individual level, care can be used to justify the hoarding of wealth, or when geared towards more liberatory aims, it can be used to serve as a foundation for bonding and substantiating self-worth. Care can show up in tactics like corporate welfare or nepotism that keeps wealth and resources in the hands of a few, or it can motivate efforts to address community inequalities. I'm going to turn it over to Danielle to talk a little bit about that. So the data that we analyzed for this study actually comes from two different community-based research projects that Anjali have done that promote well-being and transformative change in marginalized communities. And we do this because we believe that if we synthesize data from these two settings, though they're very different in terms of their geographies and social locations, will allow greater insight into the really diverse contexts that generate liberatory care ethics, as well as the possibility for an ethics of care framework to cross borders, to cross age boundaries, nationality, and other socially constructed differences. So half of the excerpts that we use as illustrative analyses involves interviews with Latinx youth that I conducted as part of a larger project on children's involvement in an activist art making process. So the data here analyzed included one-on-one semi-structured interviews with 8 working class Latinx youth between the ages of 11 and 12 who were involved in a multi-year participatory action research project at a public elementary school in California. And so the children here created a large publicly visible mural that represented the hopes, strengths, and struggles of their community. And the interviews that were conducted with Nicaraguan, I conducted the interviews with Nicaraguan women as part of a larger mixed methods study on feminist community change. The data analyzed for this portion of the project were 14 interviews with women who are members of the feminist organization in a rural and particularly impoverished region of the country. The interviews focused on women's experiences, opinions, and efforts to create change in their own lives and their community. For our analysis of the combined sets of the interviews, Danielle and I focused on themes related to embodying care ethics and efforts to promote change at 4 different ecological levels of analysis: the individual, interpersonal, community, and structural. And for today, we selected 2 excerpts from each of our data sets to illustrate manifestations at each stage. Right. So first I'll talk about self-care. So self-care in a neoliberal framework can manifest in these sort of performative acts of often feminized consumption in the name of pampering or individual indulgence that often entails a hyper focus on the self at the expense of the well-being of others, often the underpaid labor of poor women and immigrants. Alternatively, the notion of self-care as developed by marginalized groups, namely Black, queer, and feminist communities, conceptualized attending to one's own well-being as an act of defiance and resistance to oppressive systems that dictate whose lives are worthy and have value. Liberatory self-care, however, is enacted in and with community. So as Sara Ahmed writes, quote, "In directing our care towards ourselves, we are not caring for those we are supposed to care for." And that is why in queer, feminist, and anti-racist work, self-care is about the creation of community, end quote. So one Latina youth, Layla, echoes this sentiment in her conceptualizations of the self in relationship to her social change work. So she explains how she cultivated a sense of confidence and self-esteem through her connection to her community. So she says about her role in the activist art project, my role in the program was helping the community get closer. I think it was also something that all of us created. You know, I think my role was just helping get the stories from the community, being a part of it, being a part of the community. The program helped me get through things because, I mean, in the 4th grade, I didn't believe in myself as much to run for secretary and president. I had really low self-esteem, so I thought, you know, like if participating in the program helped me, why can't I help others and reach out to them? So it's noteworthy here that building self-esteem and self-confidence were not explicit purposes of the participatory action research program, yet in her estimation, this self-esteem, this confidence translated into her running for and obtaining these formal leadership positions on her school council.
And she also conceptualized this self-work in terms of its potential reverberations out into the community, and considers how she may in turn then help others who may also need this support. So self-care here is realized when social support structures are available to allow one the resources to focus on individual capacity building.
So it might not sound particularly provocative to assess care at an interpersonal level, since some might argue that this is the domain where caregiving belongs. However, interviews were filled with examples of ways in which participants' depth of understanding about the necessity of care resulted in an internalized understanding of the self as one inherently connected to others who foster well-being and justice through interpersonal caring relations. This diverges from dominant views on caregiving as paternalistic practices in which a compassionate or obliged person engages, but rather because the self is always connected to others, care is an essential practice in expressing full humanity and building capacity for justice. This could be seen in the interviews I conducted with women in Nicaragua when women discussed the values they taught to their children. So for example, one woman shared, "With my son, I tell him he has to respect women's rights a lot, that he cannot offend them in any way, because you are the son of a woman. You have to respect women. To my daughter, I say she has to gain respect and value herself as a woman, that she cannot take into account what men say, rather she has to say that she has rights as a woman." So in this example, the woman interviewed demonstrates an understanding of self as connected to others and the importance of acknowledging relational realities and dialogue for change with younger generations. She's transmitting values to her children and showing concern about their experience and underscoring that this is that it's important, and this is a particularly important but not under-acknowledged aspect of paternal care. However, the values conveyed here illuminate aspects of the liberatory ethics of care, and that they demonstrate a deep understanding of the reality that people are always connected to others, and thus the ways in which our actions affect others should play a critical role in influencing our beliefs and behaviors.
So then ethics of care at the community level involves expressing care in change strategies and activities that impact one's neighbors, school, social identity groups, other geographically bound groups. So this manifested in my interviews, viewees' conceptualizations via a shared commitment to subvert what we referred to earlier and what Martine Barreau refers to as alienating systems and experiences. For example, these youth stressed that a goal of their community-based action was to provide social support to overcome individualistic narratives and alienation. So one youth, Carmen, explains that the mural that she and her co-creators painted at their school reminds the people in her community that the experience of struggle is ubiquitous. So she says it, referring to the mural, could help them, their community, with their life, I guess, if they're going through a tough time, it could really help them. Let's say they think their life is worth nothing. Well, everybody's been through something at least, and so they have their own history. So overcoming individualism and alienation demands this recognition of shared inequities, which is necessary for attributing the source of social problems within structures rather than individuals. Thus, the social action these young people undertook enhances the sense of ownership and belonging within the community.
Lastly, we'll talk about liberatory care and just structures. So finally, both groups who were interviewed discussed interest and efforts to produce structural change, which included desires or efforts to transform institutions, policies, and dominant cultural narratives, all of which inhibited justice and well-being in their respective communities. But in order to achieve these goals, an ethic of liberatory care was used to guide work to create more just community structures. So this comes through in a conversation with one woman named Delana. So I asked her, what other things have you learned since you were organized, which means being involved in the feminist organization? And she said, first of all, to get along with others in my community and to have good relations with other women in the community, because together we can do a lot. When we want something that benefits the community, we can defend ourselves. For example, we submitted a letter to a person in Managua about bringing electricity. We took that letter to the government official of the community, then we went to visit the mayor, but they would not let us enter. Then we said, if they do not allow us to enter, we will form a commission of people, and by force we entered. We were not scared to speak because we were prepared. We said we are citizens of this community and the government has to take into account everyone. and they let us in and they heard us. So, while the actions developed to force the mayor's office to hear and respond to women's demands, which were to bring electricity to the community, are profound in their own right, what's particularly important in this context is the way solidarity formed and the foundation as the basis and foundation of their efforts. Women's incentives and motivations stem from their understanding of their connections to each other, and with this framework, they came closer to promoting social justice. So, as described, ethics of care refers to a moral orientation focused on maintaining relationships, responding to the needs of others, and a responsibility not to cause harm. And this orientation runs in direct contrast to the values articulated, albeit not always practiced, within neoliberal policies and ideology, which prioritize individual needs and freedom from responsibility and efficiency over collective concerns. Moreover, while historically conceptualized as distinct from justice, a united focus on care and justice creates conditions for liberation. So although justice is primarily focused upon producing equitable distribution of everything that sustains a healthy life, care is inherently linked because it is associated with ensuring that the needs of individuals within communities are met in a compassionate manner. So finally, we have lots of people to thank this research. Thank you. Yeah. So yes. Yes. I know we're running very behind on time with all the technical, so we're happy to take a question or two or direct it to anybody at this point, but with the late start, I don't want to hold anyone from moving on to whatever you're planning next. I don't know. I'm not sure if there's someone in this room after. Yes.
I have a question for anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And it occurred to me in listening to your presentation, which I fully recommend. This current phenomenon in our society, Western free societies, of the increase of people coming out or wanting to experiment with poly relationships.
Mm-hmm. Back
in the 60s, there was, I think, a precursor to some of this was families of choice out of the LGBT community. But this phenomenon of poly relationships strikes me as worth investigating and exploring as an, if you like, an unconscious reaction to what is the colonized construct of love.
Mm-hmm.
Monogamy has to be, that privileged over other relationships. Well, I think are really exploring different ways to matrix interconnectivity. And I'm curious about what your thoughts are on that.
My initial thought went right to the question about loneliness and how in this neoliberal context, people are more isolated and they're encouraged to think about the self. Yet that's not what humans have evolved to do, arguably. We are a more communal species, which is maybe a controversial statement, but I think your question is really interesting, and I think it taps in. I don't know the definitive answer, obviously, but I think it to me it provokes some thought that is the next room coming in, but
yeah, right.
Yeah. But I think you're getting into something really. I wanted to say Darlingtina might have some really interesting thoughts to add, particularly given your study. But I will close this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.